My old friend Ben Sasse. Ben attended, if you'll excuse the expression, Harvard. Where he wrestled. He earned his PhD in history from, excuse me again, Yale. But more pertinently to today's discussion, he also earned an MA from the Great Books College, the Great Books College, St. John's of Annapolis. Ben began in financial services, I believe, if I remember correctly, Boston Consulting Group. He became president of Midland University in his native Nebraska. And then he served from 2015 to 2023 in the United States Senate as a senator from Nebraska. He currently serves as the president of the University of Florida, where he is doing great things. Welcome, Ben.
Delighted to be with you all. And I just want to say up front, I'm embarrassed that I don't have an ugly coat. I mean, I got a medium coat, but like Bill Walton, I got a lot of friends in this room, and Bill Walton promised me an ugly coat, and he didn't deliver, so.
Well, we're here for a conversation this morning about the question of why great minds matter. We might begin with, of course, the prior question, do great minds matter? Do we want our young men and women, those entrusted to our charge, to be exposed to the great thinkers of the past? Or are they the past? Did history really begin yesterday, and we have nothing to learn from people who had, dare I say it, in many cases, faults, even grave faults? Or is the study of the great minds, the great thinkers of the past, and their reflection on the great issues of meaning and value, something that's simply not relevant to modern life? Should we be focused on vocational training? Should we be focused on forming young men and women to be social activists, social justice warriors? Or should we retain and reform and renew the tradition of liberal arts learning? A few years ago, Ben, someone who served with you in the United States Senate and is in fact senator from your current state of Florida, Marco Rubio, someone for whom I have great regard and admiration, made a statement asking why students should waste their time, as he had it, studying philosophy. What good would come of that? Shouldn't they be focused on more practical things? So let's begin with Senator Rubio's question. Should we encourage our students to study philosophy, history, political theory, sociology, literature? Should we encourage them to study Plato, Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, Erasmus, the American founders? Or should we encourage them instead to just focus on practical things, perhaps computer science, economics, things that will have positive benefits for their careers? What do you think?
So to the first frame on the question, should we read all those great big ideas, big thinkers, big books? Of course the answer is yes, but I don't really think it's an or, right? So Marco's a buddy, so I don't need to pretend to speak for him or redeem his framing. But I think what he was probably saying was, do we trust these institutions to lead our kids to do these things? Not, should you read and study big, important thinkers and ideas? So maybe at a macro, and I'm getting a little feedback. You all good? Does this sound okay for you? Okay. This is a steep room. I mean, maybe it's just the disorientation of the coats, but still. By the way, I should just say, I mean, the Ivy League can't save America right now because the Ivy League doesn't even want to save itself. But inside the Ivy League, I'm a pretty pro-Princeton guy. I think this tradition you have around reunions is glorious. And I think I didn't ever get a study here. I worked in the archives for a while when I was writing my dissertation. So I spent a number of weeks here one terribly cold January. But I never studied at Princeton, but I've always loved it because this is the third time I've gotten to do your reunion weekend. It's pretty glorious. So I won't pander, but I'll just say I'm pro Princeton. But the world is broken. The world's fallen and humans are broken. So at the end of the day, you're gonna have to restrain evil. And the question is, do you do it by government, or do you do it by creating free people who believe in self-discipline, self-restraint, and self-control as opposed to other discipline, other restraint, other control? And if you believe in freedom, if you believe in dignity, if you believe in republics, of course you have to study and wrestle with all the big stuff you're talking about.
You made a decision yourself to attend St. John's of Annapolis. What prompted that? Why would you spend, I believe it takes 16 months there to earn the master's degree. Why would you invest the time in studying the great books?
Remedial education. I mean, I went from age 24 to 26 to do the master's at night because I thought coming out of undergrad and at age 22, I hadn't read enough important stuff.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, it seems to me, and you may disagree, but it seems to me that part of the problem here is that the humanities, and more broadly the liberal arts disciplines, have in many cases shot themselves in the feet by taking ideological turns that compromise liberal arts learning. They've made themselves both unattractive to students and unfaithful to the traditions that we would like the students to appropriate for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think 100 years from now, when you look back at our moment, nobody's going to talk about our politics. They're going to talk about the fact that we were living through a technological revolution that created an economic revolution that undermined our sense of place. Everything that's wrong in politics is a distant footnote on the fact that tribalism is just a way to try to make up new community when you feel really lonely and you don't have community, you don't have thickness. And that's because the technological revolution we're living through is pretty dang fascinating. It's horrific and awesome at the same time. Marginal, the quantification, computing, whatever revolution you want to call this, where marginal cost of compute is going to either fall to actually zero or so close to zero that we're not going to meter it anymore. It means anything that you can reduce to a series of steps is ultimately going to become free. I don't know if it's 5 years away or 25 years away, but we're going to have robots that build robots for us, right? We're the richest people any time and place in human history. And I don't mean those of you who can help fund the Princeton endowment. I mean median Americans are the richest people any time and place in human history. And the hockey stick curve of how rich we're all going to be is going up, up, up from here. That's great at the level of consumption, but it's terrible at the level of production and feeling like you're needed, feeling like you have any purpose. Does anybody need me? If you wake up on Monday morning and you don't think your work matters, it's a near certainty that your life is gonna stink, right? People with lots of inherited wealth, the Saudi royals, people who win the lottery, they don't end up happier 10 years later, right? Earned success makes people feel like they have meaning and purpose and connection to other places. And so we shouldn't minimize why students are migrating to STEM. They're migrating to STEM because we live at a really fascinating moment in the history of STEM. But the qualitative is still the most important stuff. The quantitative is how we pay the bills, it's how we go to the moon, it's how we win wars, but the stuff that shapes souls is still about truth and goodness and beauty and meaning and purpose and love. Persuasion is way more important than power and riches. And right now, we don't have humanities faculties at hardly any schools in the country that you would say, yeah, I want to turn over the soul of my 18 to 22-year-old to those people's tutelage for a while, right? The narrowness of the monoculture worldview, it isn't just wrong on most questions, it's boring as hell. And it's super nichified. The vast majority of people wanting to do research in the humanities aspire to talk to the high 2 digits, right? Like it's not interesting enough. Big history, big philosophy, big ideas across time and space should be stuff that warrants 48 months of our kids' life at the most interesting time. Age 20 is about the coolest time you could ever live. And the opportunity cost of spending it stupidly is such that, to defend Marco, there are many places where I'd say, yeah, it'd be better for you to study philosophy with those people instead of getting a job and then reading at night with your neighborhood discussion group.
It seems to me that we all, throughout life, but certainly kids in college, have a lot to learn from, for example, Shakespeare. Not just the appreciation of his marvelous wit and his wisdom, but a lot to learn about human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny. So if a student wants to major in English literature or take classes in English literature with a view to studying Shakespeare, I see that as a wonderful thing. But if being an English literature major means studying theories about Shakespeare, quite independently of Shakespeare, and especially if the object of the exercise is to debunk Shakespeare or belittle Shakespeare or expose Shakespeare because he has incorrect views about race, class, gender, and so forth, then frankly, I don't see the point, and most students don't see the point, and certainly most parents don't see the point, especially at $85,000 a year, of having a student major in English literature. So
you're just quoting Kenan Thompson from the SNL opening 2 weeks ago. Do you realize that Columbia wants $84,000 a year?
So there is the question then of what the mission of the university is. And for
Actually, Robbie, can I just agree with you one more thing? Since you flagged St. John's, one of the glories of taking text seriously is a humility that says, I don't believe that just because I'm alive at this moment, everybody who's trending at my moment are the smartest people that have ever lived. The sort of arrogant, you can't go to the future to get a perspective on the present, so you have to go to the past to get outside the assumptions of our historical moment about everything. And so at St. John's, one of the things that happens is there is no doctor or professor this or that. There are no titles. Everybody is Mr. or Ms. because the professor is the text we're reading that week. So Shakespeare is grand, and we're wrestling to understand it. Is he right about everything? Hell no. But he's right about a lot of stuff that we can't naturally see. And so you want to wrestle with the text with a little bit of humility before it.
We in the Madison program take our mission to be forming the young men and women entrusted to us by their families, forming them to be determined truth seekers, courageous truth speakers, and lifelong learners. And from our point of view, that really does mean exposing them to the best that has been thought and said, not in some ideological way, quite the contrary. We want to introduce them to the great debates on the great issues that go all the way back to antiquity. But in the current milieu, our adopting that attitude labels us as some sort of reform movement. And indeed, I think in many ways we are. But I think these are reforms that we really desperately need in American higher education. And I know that you in Florida are trying to institute those similar reforms, including by establishing new programs like the Madison program.
That's right. The Hamilton Center that we've been building, and thank you for some of the faculty that you've loaned us, at the University of Florida, we have 6,400 professors. We have 16 colleges and schools, but Hamilton is our latest, and they're currently called a center, but will eventually be upgraded to a college or school. I think Hamilton is probably the most sought-after job in higher education in America right now. We had over 1,200 applicants in about a 10-month period this year to become a professor there. And New York Times and other places have tried to write pieces and call the Hamilton Center a right-wing this or that. It's just classically liberal. Like, it's not right of center. We're not interested in your politics. And lots of the faculty who are applying are from Ivies and Ivy Plus, top 15 institutions who are way left of center. I just happen to know a lot of them personally. And so that's the only reason I know anything about their politics. But they just want to teach at a place that's humble enough to say, we're wrestling with big questions here, and political indoctrination is boring. That's not what an educational institution exists to do.
Yeah, I can tell you a bit of the backstory. About 5 years ago, out of the blue, I got a phone call from a recently elected, very narrowly elected governor. He was the governor of Florida, a man named Ron DeSantis. I hadn't met Governor DeSantis before, certainly never spoke to him. But he called me because he had been hearing good things about the James Madison Program at Princeton, and he wanted to know from me whether I thought similar programs could be built at state universities like the state universities in Florida. And I said that while my own experience was in private universities, not in state universities, and I'm sure that there are some differences that would have to be taken into account in building programs, I didn't see any reason why you couldn't build programs like the Madison Program in such universities. And he asked whether he could send a delegation up to Princeton to meet with me and my staff and faculty associated with the Madison Program and others. And he sent a delegation of 11 people, the presidents at the time of the three largest state universities in Florida, the Commissioner of Education, his own chief of staff, representatives from the legislature, trustees, and they spoke to the staff and spoke to faculty, visited President Eisgruber. We had a wonderful couple of days with them, and then they went off and started building these programs, and I'm just delighted to see the flourishing of the Hamilton program, and of course on a scale that's far beyond anything that we could do in a place like this. And I'm also glad to be supplying you with faculty down there. I think the alumni of the Madison Program's postdoctoral fellows and visiting fellows program are some of the finest, especially younger scholars in American higher education. And it's great for the cause of learning and great for them to be part of such an exciting project as the Hamilton Program. And the Hamilton Program, as Ben knows, is by no means unique. I mean, it's the top dog
Kind of
right
unique.
now. But similar programs are, and whole schools are at Arizona State, University of Texas, Austin, where Harlan Crow, Kathy's husband, is so deeply involved. University of Tennessee, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Now the Salmon P. Chase Center on Civics, Culture, and Society is being built at Ohio State, with similar institutions being built at 3 smaller Ohio universities. So I think there's a movement going on, Ben, and you're in the vanguard of it.
It's a special moment in a lot of these institutions, but I think I want to be delicate. We all love our alma maters. You all love your alma mater. I'm on your campus. I'm in your home, so I don't mean to be critical, but I do think some of the reason the reform movement is coming from large land-grant universities is because the Ivy League has so much money that it's hard to figure out how it could reform itself when it's gone down some of the cul-de-sacs of the last 5 to 20 years, right? The line that Princeton's become a perpetual motion money machine, that the spinoff from the endowment is about twice your operating budget every year, so why would there be a need to reform when some of the crazy stuff that's happened on humanities faculties has happened? And I think across the country, there are tons and tons of parents. Of course, none of us should generalize too much from anecdote, but I don't have a day that goes by where I don't hear from lots and lots of parents of 1,500 SAT kids who say, I don't have any idea why I would send my kids to the Ivy League. I understand the legacy brand. I'm just not sure their educational experience will be worth their time. And so there's a reform movement happening outside the Ivy League because the Ivy League looks like it's going to have a real tough time getting serious about admitting some of the missteps of late by getting drunk on identity politics.
Well, if I may humbly suggest, I think that there is a way that we can reform the Ivy League, and it's a question of how you direct your generosity to your alma mater.
I gave him a pitch.
But I didn't say that. Ben, what about the other universities in the state? What can you tell us about what's going on in Florida International, Florida Atlantic, Florida State, and so forth.
So just to set the stage for a second, what's happened in Florida over the last 5 years is extraordinary. I see Dean here, for instance, who's been one of the key leaders of what's happened. But Florida is the 14th largest nation on earth if it were a standalone GDP. If Florida's a standalone nation, it's the 14th largest GDP, and it's the fastest growing of those 14 nations, and it's undersupply sided, right? So there's far more need for human capital upgrade in the state of Florida than there are slots at universities. So we have 12 publics in the state, and they each serve in really important ways, but just to touch on a few of them that you named, Florida International University, FIU in Miami, is the #1 Hispanic serving institution in the country. I want to say this delicately because we all have supercomputers in our pockets. That means I know that everything is recorded forever. But the vast majority of kids who are at FIU's law school would be at UF's law school if they could have gotten in, and yet FIU's bar passage rate is higher than UF's. Why? The gritty curve of the kind of students that FIU is serving just kind of makes me tear up. Like, I love that place. I don't know what the right number is, 60,000 students, Dean, 60-ish. And #1 Hispanic serving place in the country, and it's in Miami, the 9th largest metro, and completely undersupply sided from a higher ed standpoint. Miami's just one of the most fascinating places on earth right now. UCF in Orlando is gonna turn out, 35,000 engineers this year. The scale of what's happening at a lot of these institutions is pretty crazy. We do 39 graduations a year at UF. I did 21 graduations in the first 8 days of May this year. At UF this year, we graduated twice as many undergrads as Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined, and our average SAT scores are almost in the same place. So there's just a ton of stuff happening in Florida right now that I think 10 years from now when we look back, we're gonna say, wow, a fish can't describe water because he's never not been in water, but what's happening in Florida is one of the most interesting economic and therefore cultural stories in America in the last century.
Now I want to talk about a problem, Ben. It's in a way a good problem to have, but it is a problem. I call it the supply problem because that's in fact what it is. I just mentioned that in addition to the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, there are the centers being built at the other Florida State universities. There's the big program at Arizona State, the big program at University of Texas, Austin, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tennessee, Knoxville, Ohio State, and so forth. Some of those are hiring, well, Hamilton announced just yesterday the hiring of 21 new faculty members. Some of them are going to be hiring 50 or more. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill will be hiring 50. They're looking for people who are committed to the mission of these universities to provide the highest quality, non-ideological civic education in the country. Historians, political scientists, economists, legal scholars, philosophers, sociologists, and so forth. Now, for most of my 24 going on now to 25 years leading the Madison program, we had a challenge of placing our postdoctoral fellows, finding them jobs because there just weren't places that wanted to hire people with that kind of vision for civic education. Now we've got the opposite problem. We can't supply enough, and the other PhD or postdoctoral supply units around the country won't be able to supply enough. Now, the competition that's going on is good. The Hamilton Center is competing, usually winning, in the competition for talent with Arizona State and the other places. But now, since we have state-mandated programs with courses that are going to have to be taught, faculty appointments are going to have to be made, slots are going to have to be filled, and the danger is that people will be hired who are not on board with the mission, or standards would be lowered in order to fill those classes. And I think either of those would be something between disastrous and catastrophic for the reform movement that we're helping to lead. What's your reflection on that?
Well, I certainly agree with you that we need people to be investing in things like the Madison Program. So I'll shill for a second for Robbie and say thank you to all of you who make these kinds of investments. But I do think it is useful to think about it from a supply and demand standpoint on these courses. The core curriculum is a disaster at most institutions, right? We named this about the liberal arts tradition and Western civilization and what does it mean to have free people for a free republic. But we could have also just named this whole session a debate about what the core is. I'm a big defender of a core curriculum. I think you want a shared experience where adults help mediate the question of what's worth your time. And yet, at most schools in the country, I wouldn't want my kids to have to waste any of their time taking the core. You take 120 credit hours to graduate at most institutions. It's usually about 45 for your major, so a little more than a third, and usually 36 to 40, so right at a third of your credit hours are in the core. And at most schools, if you look at the menu of so-called shared experience in the core, it's like a menu from the Cheesecake Factory, where afterwards you all had 5,000 shared choices, but that didn't mean you actually had any shared experiences. And I won't nerd out as a historian going from, World War II and the GI Bill and the debate about the Harvard Gen Ed reform and whatever. But from 1945 to 1960, there was a big, meaningful debate in America about what the core curriculum was for. In the late 1960s, that debate started to fray. 1963 is a pretty glorious moment in the civil rights movement. 1968, 69, 70 just got pretty stupid in the protest culture. And the debates about what the core was for sort of atrophied in the early 70s, and people just lost interest. And I think folks like you all who care about the future of your institution and the future of the country, we need to re-engage in debates about what the purpose of a core curriculum is for, because going back to where you opened with Marco, I'm pro-philosophy, but I'm anti most stupid philosophy courses, which are narrow, deep, and predictable identity politics. And so what we need is a debate about what the core is for and is it worth our kids' time, and that should create a pull signal, a demand signal that would create lots more supply, because we would know we need to turn out these professors. When I was finishing my history PhD at Yale in 2004, the Chronicle of Higher Education put on their cover what's called the pit at the AHA, American Historical Association, where your job interviews are the first week of January every year. They hung PVC pipe at the Marriott Hotel at Wardman Park in DC for the conference, and they decided to not even leave alleys or pathways. Just the whole room had 5x5 PVC pipe hanging from the ceiling with curtains, and it was like Battleship. Your interview is not in B7, sir, it's in J5. And you just have to lift the curtain through 17 different people's interview to get to the place. And the headline was, "In the pit at AHA, would-be historians beg for jobs they don't really want." And there were 41 PhDs for every history vacancy. So we've way oversupplied the country with humanities faculty. We got way too many. But we have way too few who believe in actually serving students by helping them wrestle with big questions.
We got a big problem there, and it's a big challenge for us. Now, most people see what's happening on the stage in higher education. Programs are created, faculty are hired, courses are taught, students sign up for the courses, degrees are granted, and so forth. I'd like to bring our friends, Ben, into what's going on behind the curtain. And particularly, I want to talk about credentialing and accreditation. This is what people don't see. The public doesn't see what goes on there. For people to advance in higher education, to be credentialed, they have to jump through certain hoops. For all practical purposes, today you need a PhD, or in some disciplines the equivalent. For all practical purposes today, even in the humanities now and social sciences, and not just in the natural sciences, you need postdoctoral education, ideally a prestigious postdoctoral appointment. There are other ways in which the academy itself charts its own future and shapes itself by honoring certain sorts of achievement, or what's taken to be achievement, and not honoring what is regarded as not worthy, rightly or wrongly. And then there is accreditation. especially for state universities, of course, a lot will be determined by what the state legislature does, what the regents do, but universities require accreditation. And the regents and the legislators don't have control over the accreditors. And accreditation, as far as I can see, functions essentially as a cartel today. And it's not a cartel that's friendly to the kind of liberal arts education that you and I represent and are working for. So I think one of the challenges before us is to deal with what's going on behind the curtain that people don't see. We need the reform of the credentialing process and the reform of accreditation. What's your view on that?
We're staying until 5 o'clock here, right? That's my sense of what we're doing with this session, because that's a really important topic with lots of sub-threads. So maybe I'll name two big bundles. I'll get to yours second, which is where the credentialing machine bridges to the accreditors. But first, I think we should all just recognize that the credentialing machine is a big bundle, right? Like lots and lots of stuff happens. Robbie and I were joking on the way over because of this Power 5 conferences, athletics, settlement negotiation that I'm involved in. When you're at a big university, you sort of run a hospital system that has some professional sports franchises, and every once in a while you get to do some academics. And when you think of the bundle of what most 17 and 8-year-olds or 18-year-olds are thinking about when they head off to school, it is about a whole bunch of things like, how am I gonna have fun? Where am I gonna meet a mate? What sports am I gonna root for? What job am I likely to get next? What are my summer internships as I transition out of mom and dad's house and live in different housing and eat food? Oh yes, I also should have a major that has some classes that I think are worth my time. And that bundle is both the real world and it's pretty sad, right? That we don't think enough about whether or not the core academic pieces of the bundle are serious. And I think humility probably requires us to admit that a lot of how we've inherited 1945 to 2015 branding is not the only way to do this, right? So I want us to be open to the idea of some more radical unbundling. If I think about my kids, I have 23 and 20-year-old daughters and a 12-year-old son. And if they were all 15, 16, 17 at once, and I was thinking about where do I want them to spend ages 18 to 22? Pretend money's no object, pretend network is no object. You can get into any room and you can afford anything. What would you do with their 48 months? This is a pretty fascinating moment in a big, interesting, diverse world. Kind of the one certainty I have, if I had my druthers, if I'm king for a day, I'd never send them to one zip code for the whole 48 months. I'd much rather have them have a cohort and a community that's synchronous a lot of the time, but I'd send them across the world and want to read a whole bunch of big and important stuff and have a bunch of work experiences and internships. Huge parts of what it means to get to live, I don't know your zip code, 06 something something. Whatever this zip code is for Princeton, it's pretty glorious, but I still doubt that kids are better off having 8 semesters here than 7 and a great study abroad experience, or 6 and a great study abroad experience and a great 6-month internship. So I would like us to break the bundle in some ways, and I think that technology is going to do that more than, I'm kind of excited about it, but more than maybe a lot of people at institutions like this want to admit. 100 years ago, we used the word doctor, and we didn't really distinguish much whether you meant oncologist, anesthesiologist, gynecologist, ophthalmologist. You're a doctor, you're an expert, you know stuff about the body that I don't. Today we still use the word doctor as an honorific, but we care a hell of a lot whether you mean oncologist, gynecologist, ophthalmologist, anesthesiologist. These are different things, right? We still use the word professor like it's a generic umbrella term. And I don't mean historian versus biologist, in the same way that surgeons might be ear, nose, and throat versus hips and knees. I mean functionally. There's a big difference between someone who designs a syllabus, the greatest sage on the stage lecturer, somebody who's really good at running a discussion seminar, someone who does grading and assessment, life coach, instructional technology. I think these roles are going to be radically unbundled in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, because it isn't the same thing to lead the kind of seminar Robbie leads and to teach a big accounting lecture class. I don't mean that to disparage accounting. I just mean there's no data that shows a 300-to-1 accounting class is better than an infinity-to-1 online accounting class with small group, low stakes, high frequency quizzing and remedial sections. And so I think we're gonna unbundle what happens in education, and that's mostly a good thing because technology is gonna make us ask questions about whether we're spending time well enough. Now, getting to the assessment, the accreditation question. I'm saying nothing capital P political. There's nothing partisan in what I'm saying. But the small p politics around accreditation are a nutty cartel, right? Like shared governance should mean the experts that teach in their field are involved in the debate, and the people who pay the bills or have to make institutional governance decisions should be involved in the debate as well. This is just Aristotle 101. Committees deliberate better than individuals. Individuals execute better than committees. So the American three-part distinction about legislative, executive, judicial functions, at one level, it's just a practical instantiation of Aristotle's wisdom about dialogue being useful. Shared governance should mean faculties are involved in decisions. It sure as hell shouldn't mean faculties have monopolies on decision-making and absolutely no external accountability. And most of the accreditors have been captured by an assumption that boards and people who pay the bills and presidents of institutions should shut up and stay out of the way. Go raise the money and hand it over and let the faculty make all their own decisions. What is happening to our students in their core curriculum is a pretty good example of the system not having enough accountability. And right now, the accreditors are mostly defenders of the status quo. And I think this world is going to be fractured for a whole bunch of reasons. Again, I'm not meaning to get anywhere near the politics, but the state of Florida has some pretty weird economics, which is my institution has had price controls for 14 years. So our tuition is $6,300, and our median kid at nearly 1,500 SAT gets an $8,000 Bright Futures scholarship from Tallahassee. So our kids all get rebate checks. Everybody gets paid to be a student at the University of Florida. We're a service academy with no service requirement. You arrive, and on day 3, we write you a rebate check, right? All of our bills are paid by appropriations. And again, this is not right-left partisanship, but it is appropriations politics. They want to know whether or not what we do at the University of Florida is worth the taxpayers' money and worth our students' time. And if the accreditors say that they're disinterested in having our institution have to answer questions about what happens, ultimately, I don't think the state of Florida would really care about accreditation because everybody's getting paid by Tallahassee anyway.
So one of the takeaways that I hope people will take away from the discussion today is that we need to be concerned about and involved in the reform of not only what's going on the stage, but what's going on behind the curtain. We cannot effectively, in the end, reform what's going on the stage unless we also reform what's going on behind the curtain. There's a kind of ecosystem of academia. It's got lots of moving parts, and we need to disseminate knowledge more widely, I think, about those parts, especially the parts behind the curtain, and we need to be active in trying to make a difference there, both in state universities and in private universities. Ben, if I just put you the question, what's the mission of the University of Florida? What's the answer?
Well, it's obviously plural, right? First of all, we need to win national championships in football again.
That's what I was worried you were going to say.
It was too easy. It's been a long time. We need to serve the students of the university, but en route to serving the state of Florida, which has massive human capital upgrade needs. 22.5 million people. I'm going to get to a liberal arts point, but I'll say something economic first. The 3 largest sectors of the economy in Florida are hospitality and tourism, construction, and agriculture. I'm from Nebraska. I see Clark Lauritsen here. First National Bank of Omaha helps, fund the most productive farmers and ranchers in all of human history. But Nebraska has 3 commodity crops. We're the biggest cattle state, and we got corn and beans. Florida has 250 commodity crops. It's crazy interesting subtropical farming. The main crops that are needed in North Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, et cetera. All three of those sectors, though, are low-wage, low educational attainment, non-growth sectors that are going to be automated. Maybe not all of hospitality and tourism, but a lot of construction and a lot of agriculture is going to be automated. The median citizen of Florida and of the United States needs to be able to do knowledge economy work, needs to be able to do work that's going to be gobbled up by algorithms so that at 35 and 40 you can get retrained and do new work. There's never been an adolescent coming of age work-based identity crisis for middle-aged people, and we're entering that world right now. And that's just to talk about the most pragmatic, practical, economic-centric pieces. But the most important things are ultimately the souls of our people. And they need to be prepared to be citizens and to make self-governing decisions about how you rebuild Tocquevillian institutions in your neighborhood. And so the University of Florida is weird in that we're flagship and land-grant. Usually you're Texas or Texas A&M, UVA, or VATech. We're both. So we're in all 67 counties. We're the #1 driver of economic activity in 45 of 67 counties in the state of Florida. But our mothership, our main campus, is 2,200 acres with 86,000 people on it. And at that campus, we supply leadership for almost every sector of Florida.
These days, one of the big issues on campus, and it didn't just start on October 7th, we've had this issue for some time, is the issue of free speech and more broadly academic freedom. So Ben, I want to take our discussion now into that territory. I just want to say a word about how I think about it, and then I invite you to react to that. In my view, in order to pursue our truth-seeking mission as faculty members, as students, especially in a research university like Princeton or the University of Florida, to do that, we need intellectual freedom. We need the exchange of ideas. And therefore, I think we should have no viewpoint-based restrictions on speech, which means that even the wildest, craziest, most disgusting and appalling things can be said. Those ideas can be tried, so long as opportunities are given to respond to them. At the same time, there do have to be prohibitions of genuine threats, deliberate incitement to imminent violence under the famous Brandenburg standard from the 1969 Brandenburg versus Ohio case, defamation, those other sorts of restrictions. And of course, violence, occupations, invasions, intimidation are absolutely intolerable. And there need to be reasonable time, place, and manner regulations of speech enforced in a viewpoint-neutral way. To me, that would create the conditions most congenial to the vigorous, robust, but civil exchange and engagement of ideas so that everybody, faculty and students alike, are in the best position to learn. What do you think?
Again, we're staying until 5 o'clock. I've got maybe 4 or 5 thoughts, and I won't finish them just so I don't give you too much of a monologue, but I'll popcorn fast. Overwhelmingly, I share your view with a couple of modifications, but I recognize that my public position looks a little bit different because of what happened on our campus in the days right after October 7th. So maybe I'll just do a tiny bit of history first, and then I'll come back to basically agreeing with you, but being open to a view of other folks that may not believe in your institutional neutrality position by thinking about a 2x2 of big versus small issues and what you talk about versus don't talk about. But first, just right after October 7th, University of Florida, University of Florida is the most Jewish campus in the country. And so there was a lot of assumption early on after October 7th that we were gonna have big conflicts on an 86,000 person campus. And I was leading us toward a position pretty similar to yours. I've been in the job for 15 months. I guess that's relevant. Historically, Florida, like most schools, has put out a lot of statements on culture war flashpoint moments and issues. And I don't think that's prudent. I think of it, again, I don't think everybody has to agree exactly with your institutional neutrality position, though I'm pretty close to it. But to me, the distinction is big topics, small topics. Do we speak about it? Do we not speak about it? 3 of those 4 quadrants are intellectually defensible. The only totally absurd position is let's talk about small stuff, but not big stuff, right? And that's what so many campuses in the Northeast did. Sombrero for Halloween? Screw you, you evildoer. Calling for the genocide of Jews? I don't know. Whatever you want, right? Like, that's what many campuses did. They created this Karen culture of telling adults what they could do on anything and everything if it fit with a kind of intersectionality grid about who was supposed to be presumed wrong on any topic. And then once From the River to the Sea is chanted on campus, then all of a sudden they all decided to swallow their whistles. And so I'm open to 3 of the 4 quadrants, but it's pretty dumb to be an institution that was ranting all the time about stuff that shouldn't have been worth bureaucrats' time, and frankly, most of the bureaucrats shouldn't have those jobs. But then all of a sudden you can't comment during this moment. So I think, I got a smattering of applause. At Florida, we weren't planning to talk, but then 3 days after, 3 plus or minus a day after, there was a vigil sponsored by Hillel and Chabad on our campus, and there were about 1,000 kids at it. My wife and I and our little kid were all at it at their prayer vigil, and a gal passed out. And when she passed out, she dropped both her backpack and her phone, and the clap of how they hit the ground sounded like gunfire. And so we had a stampede, and we ended up with, I think, 30 kids that needed stitches. So most of it was people are wearing Uggs or slippers or flip-flops, and as they were running, other people dropped stuff and phones broke. And so most of it was just people needed stitches in their feet from a little bit of glass. It wasn't a big deal, but there was quite a bit of near trampling panic in the middle of the event. And word went out among our Jewish alumni that there'd been an attack on campus. So again, the University of Florida doesn't have a pro-Israel position. I have a pro-Israel personal position that is known from my previous political life, but I've signed a 36-month pledge of partisan neutrality. I don't talk about politics in public ever. I don't support campaigns. I've mothballed all my campaign funds, so I'm not involved in politics, but it was known what my personal views had been, and when there was an assumption that there had been an attack, I wrote a letter to our Jewish alums letting them know that there hadn't been any attack on our campus, and so from there, there's been a lot of complicated issues for us to deal with. But I think fundamentally, institutions need to decide before the crisis, what do they talk about, what do they not talk about?
Yes, everyone, I think, remembers the testimony of the 3 university presidents in the House of Representatives, President Gay of Harvard, President McGill of University of Pennsylvania, President Kornbluth of MIT. They had been advised, actually, by the law firm that I myself used to work for, began my career as a young lawyer with, and they were advised properly. Their answers to Representative Stefanik's questions were technically correct. Context does actually matter in the assessment of whether you actually have protected or unprotected speech. But here was the problem, and President Sasse just put his finger on it. It rang as hypocrisy, basically because it was. Every single one of those institutions had going or recently cases where they had trampled on the free speech rights of other people, students and members of their faculty. The Tyler Vanderweel and Carol Hooven cases at Harvard, the Amy Wax case and other cases at the University of Pennsylvania, the Dorian Abbott case at MIT. And they, the presidents, and the members of Congress, and everybody else in the room knew of those cases. So they came across as hypocritical when suddenly they're invoking freedom of speech. They weren't wrong to invoke it, but they were hypocritical when they themselves or their institutions, they were all recent presidents, but some of those cases were still going on and are still going on. They came across as hypocrites because it seemed to be 2 standards. When it was anti-Semitic speech, there was one standard. When it was the restriction of other forms of speech, it was another standard.
Which is just another way of saying it wasn't really a standard. I mean, it's just straight bigotry. Right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, this wasn't a principled decision they had for free speech. It was an opportunistic answer about a principle they didn't hold to. And the Hooven case that you mentioned is, I think the glories of our First Amendment, right? We got these 5 big freedoms: speech, press, religion, assembly, protest. It is a glorious thing. The logic that underpins it is that souls can't be compelled physically, right? You have to persuade a soul. You can't coerce or compel a soul. And so the most fundamental answer that should have embarrassed those 3 presidents is that there's just too little education going on their campuses. Like, from the river to the sea, which river, which sea, and where do they go? Right, like, at the end of the day, it's a call for genocide. I don't think every kid shouting that was calling for genocide. I just think they're stupid.
Let's bring our friends here, Ben, into the discussion of institutional neutrality, the concept that you mentioned a moment ago. Let's just talk about Princeton, for example, since some people in the room have an interest in what happens at Princeton. In 2015, we adopted the University of Chicago free speech principles, very robust principles. Protecting free speech for the sake of the truth-seeking mission of this whole enterprise. That's why we adopted free speech. It wasn't abstractly because we like free speech, though we do. It was really in order that the truth-seeking mission of the university flourish. We were the second university after Chicago to do it, and the first to do it, I'm very proud to say this, by faculty vote, not being imposed on by the trustees. So I think feather in our cap for that. The University of Chicago also, though, is to my mind a model in a respect we haven't yet, I stress yet, adopted, with its so-called Calvin report. And that's a report that commits the university, goes back to 1967, I believe, commits the university to what's called institutional neutrality. Now, that is not generic neutrality. The University of Chicago is not neutral on the question of plagiarism. It's not neutral on whether the goal of the university is to pursue the truth or pursue learning or educate its students. It's not some broad, vague, general neutrality. The neutrality pertains to and only to this. The University of Chicago does not take positions on political issues. It rather provides an impartial forum for students and faculties and other constituents of the university to themselves take positions, engage each other, argue, debate, discuss to try to get at the truth of things. Under the Calvin report, every member of the University of Chicago faculty and every student at the University of Chicago is entitled very publicly to state a position. They cannot claim, though, that it is the position of the University of Chicago. We have in recent years, even here at Princeton, had not only the university as a whole take positions on political issues, we've had individual departments and programs take positions on political issues. We in the Madison program have not done that. Not because I don't have positions on issues. As a matter of fact, as many of you know, I do. But I don't think I'm entitled to commit the James Madison program, in which there are people who disagree with me, to my positions on issues. It's not my property. I don't have a proprietary interest. I have a stewardship responsibility. And I would like Princeton University as a whole to adopt the same position, to adopt essentially the Calvin report. Now, sometimes universities do have to take positions, even on political issues, where the question directly affects the ability of the university to pursue its mission. I imagine there would be legislative initiatives, I can think of one right now, I won't put you on the spot, Ben, that would raise serious complications and problems for the University of Florida. If the University of Florida took a stance on that, for example, in order to protect free speech at the University of Florida, I'm fine with that. I don't think the University of Florida or Princeton University should have a foreign policy. I don't think we should decide what the US policy toward China should be, or immigration, or the minimum wage or the progressive income tax. What's your thinking about that?
So I agree with every place that you landed, and if I were having to debate the Calvin report, what do we call it? Report. You're one of the 2 or 5 people that I'd call to tutor me right away. So I haven't had to think it through in any detail. I've read it once a couple years ago, and I know Daniel Diermeyer at Vandy has been leading his institution through a debate about it. So to the degree that I understand, I agree with you. One thing I'd muck up a tiny little bit, and I assume we agree, but the line between politics and political philosophy is pretty relevant in a moment where we have so much post-liberalism among us. And I think as defenders of the best of the American university tradition, it does have a sort of DNA that assumes we want a free republic where classical liberalism is about people wanting to persuade each other, not figure out how to use the state against their enemies. And I think being against trying to use the state against your enemies isn't really a political position, it's a philosophical position. And I think George Packer has done a nice job the last couple of years teasing out the line between our politics and the cultural erosion we have going on right behind our politics, that whenever people start talking about our politics, we immediately start talking in these binaries. And Packer does a nice job of saying, we need to all recognize that we're living through a 4-part culture war. And so he sort of numbers it. I'm oversimplifying, but his piece was 85 pages long in the New Yorker, so it needs a little oversimplifying. He numbers 1, super woke, and 4s are super MAGA, 2s are center left, and 3s are center right. And really what's happening in our country is a media ecology question of having no voice that's wide. Every conversation we have is narrow and deep now because of the incentives inside the business formerly known as media. But there are only, that wasn't a criticism of media. It was an acknowledgement of there's no business case for going wide in a world where everything's nichified. My dad was a football coach, right? So in 1982, when we went from 3 to 4 channels, it was one of the greatest things in the world because it meant you got an extra football game on Saturday. When we went from 4 to 500 channels, it still seemed pretty great. And then we went from 500 to 1,500, and we all started having some doubts. And now we've gone from 1,500 to 2,000, and I think we know objectively it's a worse experience. Like the fallacies of overchoice, if you were given the option in an ice cream shop to go into the one that has 4 flavors or the one that has 400 flavors, we all go to the one that has 400 flavors, and all the data shows we're less happy than if you went into the one that had 4. Because you have decisional regret, you have annoyance at the dude in front of you who takes too long to order. You end up not ordering chocolate, which is everybody's first or second favorite. Instead, you order like Rocky Road chocolate something with sprinkles. You're like, crap, this wasn't as good as chocolate. And so afterwards, you've wasted all this time to get a less good decision. You were trying to optimize something where sufficiency was a sufficient criteria, but that's just ice cream. But at media consumption, it's a much bigger problem because it means you have nothing in common with anybody else after you do the Rocky Road with chips, with sprinkles, with something, something, something. And so I think what's happening in our politics is a cultural problem right behind it where 1s and 4s get all the voice even though they represent almost no people. There are only about 2 million super woke people in America, like 2/3 of 1% of the public. There are a lot more 4s, there are a lot more super MAGAs, but there's still a tiny number of 4s compared to 2s and 3s. Tucker Carlson got fired a year and change ago. He's still the most watched guy on cable TV over the last 2 years, but how many people listen to Tucker Carlson? Nobody. The most watched evening programming on Fox of the last few years is Tucker. 6 times in a year, he hit 1% of the public. There are 330 million people. 6 times he hit 3.3 million people. And we all act like angry people on the 4 end of the continuum or the 1 end of the continuum are America. They're nobody. Like statistically, they just get all the voice in the way we consume social media. We are a 3 nation with institutions that come from 2. Our institutions are overwhelmingly center left, and our public is center right. 3s don't have institutions, So fours have said, we can lead you. Twos should be leading institutions, but they're led by a whole bunch of people that are so regularly cowardly, they turn the keys of their comm shop over to a bunch of 24-year-olds who don't know anything. And so ones get to speak on behalf of twos. And threes look at the world and they're like, I could live with two, but if ones are gonna try to crush me, then I'm gonna give my keys to Trump. And twos do the exact same thing. They look at threes and they say, you look like pretty reasonable people, but you don't have any institutions. It looks like January 6th is what you're in favor of. So we're gonna build a unity of ones and twos. So I think what's happening, I'll stop. Sorry, I didn't mean to get on my hobby horse. We have a big two nation that's allowing ones to speak for them. And we have a bigger three nation that's allowing fours to speak for them. But ones and fours are both post-liberal. Twos and threes should be building an alliance that defends classical liberalism, which says, nah, this election isn't the end of days. This is just how we'll do marginal tax rate policy for the next 48 months, and then we'll do it again. Let's put your arm around your neighbor. Let's go to a baseball game.
Ben, some people may be a bit puzzled to hear two conservatives defending liberalism, so we should probably say a word about the word liberalism. As President Sasse is using it, we're not talking about the liberalism of, say, Chuck Schumer, or the liberalism even of John Rawls in political philosophy, but as Ben said a couple of times, using a qualifier, we're talking about classical liberalism. Liberalism as the term figures, or as the term liberal figures, for example, in liberal arts education, or liberal democracy. The liberalism not of Chuck Schumer or John Rawls, but of James Madison and Alexander de Tocqueville. The liberalism that focuses on basic civil liberties, those 5 freedoms that Ben mentioned in the First Amendment and so forth. And in respect of education, I would say, and I'd love to have your perspective, the liberalism that is focused on liberating the student learner by expanding his or her mind, having him or her engage with the best that has been thought and said by the greatest thinkers in history. So he or she is liberated from the mundane, from the prosaic, from the widely believed but without good reason. So the liberated student, the student who's given a liberal arts education, is someone who can think more deeply, more critically, including self-critically, and above all, for himself.
Here, here. I mean, let's be real clear. When we call it mundane, that's not to belittle it. Like I today still drive Uber, detassel corn, do custodial and janitorial stuff. I vend at football games. Like working with your hands is a glorious thing, but it's not the fullness of what it means to be a human. And so when you think about the liberal arts tradition or classical liberalism, what we mean is if you don't have to live all of your life as 666 toiling, it's not just Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill forever. If you have some leisure, in the classical definition of that word, if you have some freedom from constraint, what do you love? Like, then what are your aspirations? Not do I want to live in a little casino in my pocket that will distract me forever, right? Like, think how horrific our kids' experience is right now, that we've given them supercomputers and said that this experience blocker, to steal Jonathan Haidt's great term, is the thing we should give your puberty and adolescence over to. What a crappy thing to have done to them. Right? We need to have a world that's big enough that we say, you're created with dignity. What is true? What are you gonna care about on your deathbed? And did you redeem the time between now and then? That's what the liberal tradition is about.
Yeah, you know, I say to my students, as I say to my children, there are some things that matter, but not all that much. And there are some things that really matter. Now, some things that matter are career. It does matter. Having enough money, social standing, prestige, status. Those things matter, but we have to remember they don't matter all that much. Those are things that we want not as ends in themselves ultimately, but as means to other ends. What really matter are the things that we want for their own sake. Friendship, family, faith, self-respect, honor, integrity, dignity. David Brooks has a nice way of distinguishing these categories. He calls the first category, the things that matter but not all that much, the CV virtues, the things you want to feature on your resume. He calls the latter, the things that really matter, the tombstone virtues. What do you want on your tombstone? Do you want it to say summa cum laude? Or do you want it to say Goldman Sachs? Or do you want it to say father, husband, faithful person of your religious tradition, or something like that? And for most of it, it clearly is the latter. At some level, we all grasp the distinction and the real importance of the things that really matter. And yet, in the context we find ourselves in, people can get deflected, especially young people. They can get so focused on the things that matter, but not all that much, that they fail to attend to the things that really matter. And part of our job as educators is to share with them the best thinking that has been done throughout human history, whether it's by Shakespeare, Plato, Cicero, Churchill, Lincoln, Austin, the best that has been said about the things that really matter.
Preach.
Yeah, preach.
I mean,
Dr. Brooks, do we have time to have some questions from the audience? Yeah, did you want to say something, Ben,
let's
before
do
we move to questions? Now, since President Sasse and I have these microphones, I wonder, do we have to give them up? No, Jonathan and Christy, you have microphones. Okay, so hands in the air, please. Yes, Clay up there, absolutely. My banjo playing
nice
pal.
vest, my man.
Yeah.
Two quick questions for Ben. One, we're from the 60s. There was a lot of controversy about Vietnam. There was never a freedom of speech issue. Why has that changed so much, even though there were strong disagreements then as there are today? My second question is even more important. When is University of Florida going to convert its club wrestling team to varsity NCAA wrestling?
There are so many things. Let's just be very brief on the latter. That ain't happening, sadly. Because of the way Title IX functions, we're 12 female and 9 male sports right now. And we're 58% female student body. So we need to add another female sport or take away a male sport under Title IX already. So we're going to add sand volleyball soon. I didn't mean to make an announcement, but I expect we will have varsity sand volleyball. If we were going to add more sports that touched males, our ice hockey men won a national championship in one of the club levels. So we would more likely have ice hockey for men than wrestling. But man, it's a special, as you all know, Rumsfeld became who he is, partly because of the Princeton wrestling team. To your first point, though, I lost it. What was the first point? The sports are pretty important to me, and so I got stuck. Vietnam. So I don't mean to be dismissive, but I'm a 20th century Americanist by historical specialty, and so I know the period a little bit. I didn't live it like you did, but I believe that almost the whole continuum of the debate about Vietnam in 65, 6, 7, and 8 maybe got a little less serious by 70, but a lot of the debate that was happening on campus in the mid to late 60s, people wanted to persuade other people. That's American. Like, you can have different positions on any war, and you believe that your fellow citizen next to you, your classmate, is somebody who has a brain that you want to try to persuade, has a soul that you want to try to move. That's not what's been happening at these encampments. Why is everybody putting a mask over their face? Like, this is weird. And people who won't respond to reporters who ask them, explain your position. I haven't been trained to deal with the press. I must get dear leader. Read Peggy Noonan's column of going to the encampments at Columbia. I've heard the same story from more than a dozen reporters, right? They're not trying to persuade people. I don't understand that. It's super unhealthy. But again, I'm a First Amendment zealot. I'm a free speech zealot. But I think there are two other important points to make, and I want us to get more questions in, so I won't go long on this again. But the line is between speech and action. To Robbie's point, time, place, and manner restrictions exist. You can protest at the University of Florida against some people who've been frustrated with me for it. I've defended the right of our pro-Palestinian, sometimes pro-Hamas folks to be able to show up day after day, now week after week. I think we're in day 24 of their protest on campus. I will defend their free speech and their protest rights over and over. We don't allow protest inside, though. You can't come into a classroom and start screaming. Somebody's preparing for a biology final in that classroom. This isn't the place for that. But I'll defend your right to free speech and protest, but the goal should be persuasion. It should be education. It should be moving a neighbor, not just creating something for social media. And a lot of times it feels like it's the latter, which is not to, glorify or rarefy the Vietnam debates, but I think people were trying to persuade the other side. That's not really what's happening here.
Very good. Yes, down here. Christy? She'll hand you the microphone. Yep.
As you pursue freedom of speech, isn't there a responsibility at the institutional level to provide debate environments as opposed to just a lecture of one side? Shouldn't we be modeling for the student the tradition of an honest debate and respect one to another?
Of course we should, culturally. How that actually plays out at an institution that's as fragmented as a place like ours that has 86,000 people. Princeton is a more intimate community, and I'm thrilled that you all invest in Robbie and in the Madison program and that they sponsor those kinds of debates. My guess is if we sponsored those debates, or if any large state university with tens of thousands of people, nobody notices across the cacophony of hundreds and hundreds of events that are happening every day in our little city. So to me, I'm not disagreeing with the premise of your question, but to me, I would prioritize wanting the core curriculum to usher them into big debates, not just whatever happens to be the flash button issue of the moment, but when they leave, or maybe 20 years after they leave, do they look back on the books they read, and do they have some rereadables that are on different sides of an issue than the position they hold? A liberally educated person can think there are some really great books, even if they don't agree with them.
Well, that brings up a topic that we haven't touched on today, and that's the question of viewpoint diversity. And I do think viewpoint diversity is very important if we are to pursue our truth-seeking mission. And that's especially true when it comes to the faculty. And unfortunately, we have seen over the past 40 years a very significant decline in viewpoint diversity. Too many professors tend to think, if not exactly alike, within a fairly narrow range. And people outside of the range just are not represented at a great many places. And there are real consequences to that. Now, this is not any kind of plea for affirmative action for conservatives. I don't agree with that. What I do think the solution is to stop discriminating against people who are not in that narrow range in faculty hiring and promotion. And I do think programs like the Madison program here at Princeton, the Hamilton Center at Florida, the new Salmon P. Chase Center in Ohio, will play a very important, and already where we exist are playing a very important role in ensuring that there is at least some measure of viewpoint diversity on our campus, but we need more. Next question. Yes, down here. How about this lady right here? Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you. Hi. As both a Princeton and a UF alum, I promised I would not ask any questions about the football program, though I'm dying to. But there's certainly been an ongoing debate in Florida about balancing the influence of the state legislature and the governor's office on what happens on campus, and with SB 266 and some of the other recent legislation that's been passed. How do you draw the line between protecting academic integrity and the free thought and the pursuit of truth from the interests of the state government, who does pay a lot of the bills?
Yeah, great question. So I'll just restate that fact about the bills, because our tuition is, we lose $15,000 on every student we admit. So they get a rebate check. Cost to educate is between $21,000 and $24,000. So every student we let in, we lose $15,000, and we need the legislature to fund that. They want to know that the time is well spent there. I think that is an appropriate thing. Being in the details, I think, would be an inappropriate thing. And so where is that gray line? And so you mentioned one piece of legislation. Again, I've only been there a year and change, but there have probably been 5 big bills over the last 3 years touching higher education in Florida. But probably the most controversial one, actually, let me say something that's smaller, doesn't get national attention, but I think is incredibly significant. The legislature gave the 12 presidents of the state university systems the freedom to direct hire. So we don't have to wait for faculty committees to take a process that takes a couple of years and hires only inside Robbie's alleged, I agree with him, his assertion of a narrow band of how ideological certain faculties and subdisciplines are. And so I think it's a healthy corrective. I'm really glad we have that. But you still need advisors because no one guy or gal can make that many decisions. Direct hire authority is a super important way to reform state universities in Florida faster. I think that's a great tool. Some of the issues that got most of the national headlines touched on the DEI issues. So I'll say 2 things about that. First, I really wish we would throw away the acronym and start debating particular words, because I am zealously for the aspirational best version of diversity. I am zealously for the aspirational best version of inclusion. Equity, defined by bureaucrats that wield a lot of power, what's the term mean? And as soon as you ask the question, you're into a pretty important debate. The American civil rights tradition was celebrating equality of opportunity. Could Martin Luther King Jr. be hired at universities with DEI statements today? If you look aggressively at their fine print, I think at most universities, MLK wouldn't be hireable. And that's a tragedy. This is the most important last century addition to the pantheon of American founders. So if you're zealously pro-equality, but you don't meet every bureaucrat's test of what the word equity means, you can't be hired at universities. So what happened in our state is they said you can't spend any appropriated dollars, you can't spend any public dollars creating bureaucracies around DEI issues and hiring, et cetera. That was widely believed to mean you wouldn't have African American history departments anymore, or you wouldn't have a Hispanic Students Association. None of those things were true. That was just fodder for clickbait for national folks. But I think the move was to say, are we spending our dollars on the most important things first? And I think that's a completely legitimate thing, but definitely there are lines that need to be guarded and policed culturally.
Over to
the
what I'll call the
institutional
Christie
culture.
side. Yes, Christie, right behind you there. There you go.
Yeah, David Lumet, the author of Sexual Perversity in Chicago and Glengarry Glen Ross, pretty much what you'd think of as a pretty un-MAGA guy culturally, has recently said that Trump is the best president since Lincoln. And I saw the whole interview. He wasn't being ironic or something. And I'm wondering what you make of a guy like that aligning himself with what you yourself called the fours that you normally wouldn't think he'd be aligned with.
So probably I'm right at the edge of the stuff I don't talk about. So I'll say a couple of things, and then I'll hand the microphone to the greatest living Lincoln scholar, and I'll let Professor Gelzo talk about president since Abraham Lincoln. I'll just say President Trump and I differed on hundreds of things, and we wrestled pretty hard, and he would attack me quite a bit in public, but interpersonally, we actually get along quite fine. So I'll just say that Trump is a very complicated guy, but I don't comment on anything about the 2024 election. But I think it's useful to back up and say, why would some people across a political spectrum end up in places that you wouldn't expect right now? And I think it's because of our 1, 2, 3, 4 point of folks are more doing anti politics than they're explaining what they're for. And so most people are figuring out what they're maddest about, or maybe what they're maddest about their father-in-law or son-in-law or daughter-in-law's sort of positions that seem too reflexive and not deliberative and thoughtful enough. And then they figure out who they're against, and that's how you pick a lesser of two evils. So at a polling level, is the only thing I'll say that's merely analytical. We've had decent polling about politics in America since the 1930s. And we are on our verge of the next election where we will have 5 of the most unpopular 6 candidates in 90 years of US history in 3 consecutive elections. How did we get there? That's pretty weird. Biden in 2020 doesn't make the list. But Trump 3 times, Hillary in 2016, and Biden right now are the 5 least popular presidential candidates in 90 years. That's strange. And I think it flows from the fact that, to our post-liberalism point, almost all of our institutions are in collapse. So we don't really have political parties right now. We have fully fueled up 747s sitting on the tarmac with nobody guarding the cockpit, and they're available to just be hijacked. Right? When you ask the American people, do you think of yourselves as more Republican or more Democrat? I don't have current data on this, but 3 summers ago, I got lost one weekend and read deep into all the crosstabs. And if you do not give the American public the option of saying none of the above, forced choice, do you think of yourself as more Republican or more Democrat? It was a big, exhaustive poll done 3 summers ago, where none of the above won with a hefty plurality when it wasn't an option. It was a big, broad N poll, and people would be like, whoa, what do you mean? More Republican or more Democrat? Screw that, I don't like any of those people. I'm not for any of those. About 45% of the public is there. Mid to high 20s support each of these parties, and when you drill down on why, it's mostly because of how much they hate the other party. That's not a healthy way to go forward.
Well, our time together has flown by. But before I ask you to join me in thanking President Sasse, I hope that this morning's conversation helps you to understand why I, on my November 16 presidential ballot, wrote in the words Ben Sasse.
I never pegged Professor George as a day drinker.
If you're interested in what you can do here at Princeton and beyond in the cause of higher education reform, which Ben and I are just so passionate about, I want to give you my personal email address. Be in touch with me. If you don't have something to write it down on, you can just look it up. It's rgeorge@princeton.edu. There's something in this for all of us to do, and I can think of very few things more urgent now than that. And with that, let me thank you. Let me thank my staff. Let me thank the sound crew grudgingly for their work. And above all, please join me in thanking Ben Sasse.